He was born into a world where fear was taught before language and obedience before identity. On the Alabama plantation where his life began, nothing truly belonged to him, not his body, not his labor, not even his name. From the moment he could walk, he learned the boundaries of survival, where to stand, when to look down, how to listen without appearing to hear. The land was wide and green, but it was not open. Every tree, every path, every building existed under watchful eyes. Freedom was not discussed as a possibility. It was treated as a dangerous rumor. Something that could get a person killed just for thinking about it too loudly. The plantation functioned like a small, brutal universe with its own laws. Time was measured not in years but in seasons of labor and punishment. Dawn arrived with orders, not light. Nights were short and restless, filled with the knowledge that tomorrow would demand the same exhaustion again. Children were raised communally, not because the system valued togetherness, but because families could be broken at any moment. Attachment was dangerous. Love had to be quiet. Hope had to be hidden. From an early age, he understood that survival depended on reading people as much as rules. Overseers carried authority in their voices and violence in their silences. Owners were distant, their power abstract but absolute. Enslaved adults communicated through looks and pauses through stories. That sounded harmless but carried warnings underneath. He learned quickly who had been punished, who had disappeared, and which question should never be asked. Alabama was particularly unforgiving. The geography itself worked against escape. Dense forests, swamps, patrols, and the constant threat of informants made flight seem impossible. Stories of runaways rarely ended with freedom. More often, they ended with capture, mutilation, or death. These stories were told not to inspire but to warn. The system made sure fear traveled faster than hope. Yet even in this environment, cracks existed. No system of control is ever perfect. At night, when labor paused and voices softened, fragments of another world slipped through. Whispers of places where chains did not exist. Mentions of people who lived beyond the plantation's reach. These stories were never complete, never clear, but they planted something dangerous: curiosity. Curiosity was the first step toward disobedience. His family was the center of his early world, fragile but essential. They shared food when possible, shared glances when words were unsafe, shared grief when someone was taken away. Family did not mean safety, but it meant connection. It meant that survival was not just personal. From childhood, he understood that whatever happened to him would echo through them all. The plantation enforced hierarchy, even among the enslaved, rewarding compliance and punishing solidarity. Those who appeared obedient were given slightly better conditions, used as examples. Those who resisted quietly were isolated. He learned to move carefully between these roles, never standing out, never disappearing completely. It was a balancing act learned through observation, not instruction. Violence was constant but unpredictable. Punishment did not always follow transgression. Sometimes it followed boredom, frustration, or cruelty. This randomness was intentional. It taught that there was no safe behavior, only temporary survival. Living under such conditions trained the mind to anticipate danger everywhere. It also trained it to plan in silence. Education, formal or otherwise, was forbidden. Knowledge was power, and power was not meant for him. Still, he learned what he could: directions from overheard conversations, distance measured by footsteps, the habits of patrols, the rhythms of work days. This learning was quiet, incremental, invisible. It was survival disguised as obedience. What the system underestimated was memory. He remembered everything. The faces of those who were taken and never returned. The routes wagons followed. The moments when guards were distracted. The rare kindnesses and the frequent brutalities. These memories accumulated, forming an internal map not just of the land, but of the system itself. Fear was meant to paralyze, but over time it became something else. It sharpened awareness. It taught patience. It taught timing. He did not yet imagine escape as a plan, but as a question. What would it take? That question stayed with him, unsweared but persistent. The plantation tried to define him solely by labor, but his inner life resisted reduction. In stolen moments, he imagined movement without permission, decisions made freely, a life not measured by productivity. These imaginings were dangerous, but they were also sustaining. They reminded him that another version of himself existed, even if it could not yet act. What makes this beginning important is not heroism, but context. He did not emerge from exceptional circumstances. He emerged from conditions designed to erase individuality and initiative. That he later acted at all is not proof of destiny, but of resilience cultivated under pressure. This keynote reveals the foundation of everything that followed. Escape did not begin with running, it began with seeing the system clearly enough to recognize its limits. Seeing family as worth more than personal safety. Seeing fear not as an end, but as something that could be endured and navigated. Before the first escape, before the second, before the return that would redefine sacrifice, there was this life, constrained, watched, brutal, informative, a life that taught him exactly what was at stake. Freedom was not abstract to him. It was measured in bodies, in voices, in the ability to keep a family together. The plantation believed it had shaped him completely. In reality, it had taught him everything he would later use against it. The first escape did not begin with courage so much as exhaustion. There comes a point where fear stops being a warning and becomes a weight too heavy to carry. For him, that moment arrived quietly, without ceremony. Nothing dramatic marked the decision, no speech, no farewell. Just the realization that staying meant a slow erasure, and leaving, however impossible, at least contained the possibility of something else. He had no map, no reliable guide, no guarantee that freedom even existed in a form he could reach. What he had were fragments, overheard directions, half-remembered stories, instinctive knowledge of which paths were watched and which were neglected. Escape under slavery was rarely a clean break. It was a gamble taken with incomplete information. He knew that if he failed, the consequences would not end with him. Failure would echo through his family, inviting punishment meant to deter others. That knowledge made the choice heavier, not lighter. The night he left was ordinary, which made it more dangerous. Ordinary nights bred complacency, and complacency bred mistakes. He waited until the rhythms of the plantation settled into predictability. Guards relaxed. Tools were stored, voices softened. Timing mattered more than speed. He did not run at first. He walked away from what he knew, step by measured step, resisting the instinct to flee too quickly and draw attention. The land did not welcome him. Alabama's terrain was a weapon in itself. Swamps swallowed footprints. Forests disoriented even those who knew them well. Every sound felt amplified, the snap of a branch, the rush of water, the imagined hoofbeats behind him. Fear sharpened his senses until the world felt unbearably alive. At every moment, he expected to be discovered. Hunger came quickly. So did thirst. He had prepared little because preparation itself was suspicious. Survival depended on improvisation, finding water that would not poison him, resting without leaving signs, moving without drawing eyes. The farther he traveled, the more the plantation's rules lost relevance, replaced by the raw logic of endurance. For a brief time, freedom felt real. Not complete, not secure, but tangible. No one issued orders, no bell dictated movement. The absence of command was intoxicating and terrifying. Without constant supervision, decisions belonged to him alone. That responsibility, long denied, felt almost overwhelming. But freedom without protection is fragile. The world beyond the plantation was not uniformly hostile, but it was not safe. Patrols extended far beyond plantation boundaries. Bounty hunters made careers out of tracking bodies like property. The farther he moved, the more he realized how thoroughly the system anticipated escape. Every road had watchers. Every town carried risk. Mistakes accumulated. Fatigue slowed him. Hunger clouded judgment. Trust became a dangerous calculation. At some point, he was seen. Whether it was a passerby, a patrol, or someone incentivized to report him hardly mattered. Once noticed, escape narrow, wed rapidly into pursuit. Capture was swift and efficient. There was no dramatic struggle. Resistance would only worsen what was coming. He was returned, not as a man, but as an example. The system understood symbolism. Punishment was not just corrective, it was instructional. His body became a warning designed to speak louder than words. The violence that followed was deliberate. It was meant to erase the idea of escape from his mind, and from the minds of those who watched. Pain was administered methodically, with witnesses present. The message was clear. This is what happens when you imagine yourself beyond your place. Yet something unexpected occurred. The punishment did not erase the memory of freedom. It intensified it. Pain did not undo the knowledge that life could feel different. Even briefly, the system could punish the body, but it could not unteach the absence of chains he had felt. Surveillance increased. Trust evaporated. He was watched more closely, isolated more deliberately. The plantation adjusted, as it always did, refining its methods in response to resistance. But in doing so, it revealed its own fear. Systems only tighten control when they sense weakness. Psychologically, the first escape marked a point of no return. He was no longer simply enslaved. He was someone who had crossed a boundary and survived. That survival mattered. It proved that the world beyond the plantation was real, not myth. It proved that movement was possible, even if temporary. Hope, however, became more complicated. It was no longer naive. It carried the weight of consequence. He now understood the cost of escape more fully, not just in pain, but in exposure. The system remembered. The system adjusted. Any future attempt would need to be different. The first escape failed in its immediate goal, but it succeeded in reshaping his understanding. He had tested the edges of the system and learned where they held firm and where they flexed. He had learned that freedom could not be taken impulsively. It required patience, planning, and something he had not yet fully defined: purpose. Beyond himself, what lingered most powerfully was the brief taste of autonomy. Even in suffering, that memory endured. It whispered that the life he had known was not inevitable. That knowledge, once acquired, could not be surrendered. The plantation believed it had corrected a problem. In reality, it had created a more dangerous one. A man who had imagined freedom was now a man who had experienced it. Even briefly, even imperfectly, that experience changed everything. The first escape was not heroic in the way stories often demand. It was desperate, flawed, and incomplete, but it was essential. It transformed fear into information, pain into resolve, and hope into something sharper and more disciplined. This keynote is not about success or failure as outcomes. It is about awakening, about the moment when survival begins to include the future, not just the present. After the first escape, he could no longer be contained by ignorance. He had seen enough to know that his life, and the lives of those he loved, did not have to end where they began. The price of that knowledge was high, but it was paid, and once paid, it could not be refunded. After the first escape, life did not return to what it had been. The plantation remembered. Systems of control are built on memory, and once someone is marked as dangerous, every interaction changes shape. He was no longer just labor, he was a risk to be managed. The punishment had ended, but its purpose continued. Pain was only the opening act. What followed was something quieter and more enduring: observation, restriction, and psychological pressure designed to make resistance feel futile. His movements were suddenly smaller. Tasks were reassigned not for efficiency, but for visibility. He was placed where eyes could find him easily, where mistakes would be noticed immediately, where solitude was rare. Even rest felt supervised. The message was constant and unmistakable: he was being watched, and would be watched forever. The plantation did not need to say it aloud. Surveillance communicated more effectively through presence than through threats. Isolation became another tool. Conversations that once passed unnoticed now drew suspicion. People who lingered near him were questioned or reassigned. The system understood that solidarity was as dangerous as escape. By narrowing his social world, it aimed to starve him of shared resolve. Loneliness was meant to weaken him. Silence was meant to hollow him out. The body healed slowly, but the mind was expected to break. Pain fades. Humiliation lingers. He carried the knowledge that his suffering had been public, that others had been forced to watch and learn from it. This knowledge cut deeply. It was intended to turn inward, to make him associate resistance not with dignity, but with shame. Yet the system misjudged something fundamental. Surveillance taught him as much as it constrained him. Being watched revealed patterns: who watched, when they watched, and when they grew careless. Control, like any routine, develops habits. Habits create openings. The plantation could not maintain perfect vigilance forever. No system can. He began to notice the rhythms of observation. Certain overseers were attentive only at specific times. Certain paths were monitored aggressively during the day but neglected at night. Certain signals triggered scrutiny, others passed unnoticed. This knowledge accumulated quietly, stored away without expression. He learned to appear diminished, to perform compliance convincingly. Submission became camouflage. Punishment had been meant to erase imagination. Instead, it disciplined it. He no longer allowed hope to rush ahead of preparation. Impulse had cost him dearly. Now patience became a form of resistance. Waiting was not surrender, it was strategy. Internally, the struggle intensified. There were days when despair felt heavier than chains. Days when the cost of another attempt seemed unbearable. The memory of pain was never far. Fear did its work relentlessly, resurfacing at moments of weakness. This was part of the design. Control does not rely solely on force. It relies on anticipation of force. But alongside fear existed something quieter and more durable: resolve shaped by responsibility. His family remained within reach of harm. Their safety was not separate from his behavior. The system exploited this connection, using it as leverage, but it also deepened his purpose. Any future action would need to account for them, protect them, and ultimately include them. The plantation tried to reduce his world to the present moment: work, rest, repeat. But memory resisted confinement. He remembered the absence of command during his brief freedom. That memory did not shout. It waited. It reminded him that another way of being existed, even if the path to it was unclear. Others noticed the change in him, though few could articulate it. He became quieter, more controlled, less reactive. This was mistaken for submission. In reality, it was consolidation. Energy once spent on immediate survival was being redirected inward, toward planning that did not yet have form but had direction. Surveillance created pressure, but pressure also creates strength where it does not crush. The plantation's attempt to monitor every aspect of his life exposed its own dependence on routine. Guards ired, overseers rotated, attention drifted. The system's confidence in its methods bred complacency. That complacency would matter later. Emotionally, the period after punishment was the most dangerous, not because of external threats, but because of internal erosion. Many who endure such scrutiny lose the will to imagine beyond it. He felt that erosion pressing constantly. What preserved him was not optimism but obligation. Freedom for himself alone now felt insufficient. Survival had expanded into duty. He began to think in longer spans of time. Weeks, months, even years. Escape was no longer an event, it was a process. This shift in thinking was subtle but profound. It transformed waiting into preparation and endurance into investment. The plantation believed it had neutralized him. In truth, it had forced him to evolve. The first escape had taught him that movement was possible. Punishment taught him that movement without preparation was costly. Surveillance taught him how systems watch and how they fail. This period did not produce visible defiance. There were no confrontations, no second attempt. From the outside, nothing appeared to be happening. That appearance was the system's greatest miscalculation. Resistance does not always announce itself. Sometimes it waits until it understands the terrain completely. He learned to manage fear rather than eliminate it. Fear became a tool, signaling caution rather than paralysis. He learned to observe without reacting, to listen without revealing interest, to exist within constraints without accepting them as permanent. What emerged from this time was not the same man who had fled impulsively into the woods. This was someone reshaped by consequence, someone who understood that freedom taken alone could be fleeting, but freedom taken together could endure. The plantation's methods had succeeded in one way. They had slowed him, but slowing was not stopping. In trying to suppress imagination, they had sharpened it. In trying to isolate him, they had clarified his purpose. In trying to break him, they had forced him to become more deliberate. This keynote sits at the center of the story because it explains what came next. Without this period of punishment and surveillance, the second escape would not have been possible. It would have repeated the same mistakes, met the same end. What looks like inactivity here is actually transformation. History often skips this phase. It prefers motion to waiting, action to endurance. But endurance is where resolve is tested and refined. This is where fear is confronted daily and not allowed to win. This is where imagination learns discipline. By the time the opportunity for a second escape appeared, he would be ready not because the system had loosened, but because he had learned how to move within its tightening grip. The second escape did not begin with desperation. It began with clarity. By the time he decided to leave again, the impulse to run had been replaced by something steadier and far more dangerous to the system: intention. He no longer sought freedom as a reaction to suffering, but as a calculated pursuit shaped by everything he had learned since the first failure. This time, escape was not an act of panic. It was an act of understanding. Months, perhaps years, had passed since the punishment and the tightening of surveillance. To the plantation, he appeared contained, reliable, diminished. That appearance was earned deliberately. He learned when to be visible and when to fade into routine. He accepted tasks without complaint, spoke less, and moved with predictability. Compliance became his disguise. The system rewarded this with loosened attention, not out of mercy, but out of confidence. Control thrives on the belief that it has already won. The planning was quiet and incomplete by design. There could be no written plans, no shared timelines, no obvious preparation. Everything had to live in his head, shaped by memory and instinct. He did not gather supplies in advance. He gathered information. Which nights were darkest? Which guards favored drink? Which paths were walked out of habit rather than necessity? These details mattered more than speed or strength. When the moment came, it was not announced by emotion. It arrived when conditions aligned closely enough to reduce risk, never to eliminate it. There was no perfect moment, only acceptable ones. He left without ceremony, stepping back into the unknown with a discipline born of restraint. Every movement was measured, every sound was weighed. The land felt different this time, familiar yet altered. He moved, not as someone fleeing blindly, but as someone navigating deliberately. Fear was present, but it no longer dictated action. It informed it. He rested when necessary, moved when prudent, and avoided the mistakes of haste that had caught him before. What changed most during this escape was his awareness of connection. On his first attempt, the world beyond the plantation had felt empty and hostile. This time, it revealed something else entirely: networks. Subtle, dangerous, fragile networks built on trust and shared risk. People who did not advertise their resistance but practiced it quietly. People who recognized the signs of someone running not just from bondage but toward responsibility. These encounters were not romantic or easy. Trust was slow, negotiated through caution and coded language. Help came with conditions, and often with fear. To assist him was to invite punishment. Still, assistance came in small gestures, directions given without explanation, food left without conversation, shelter offered briefly and without names exchanged. Freedom, he learned, was not solitary. It was sustained by collective courage, even when that courage could not be spoken aloud. Crossing into free territory did not bring immediate relief. Freedom was conditional, fragile, and contested. Laws shifted unpredictably. Borders did not guarantee safety. But the absence of ownership changed something fundamental. He could choose where to go, even if those choices were constrained. He could refuse an order, even if refusal carried risk. This autonomy, limited though it was, redefined his understanding of self. In free territory, he encountered ideas as transformative as physical liberty. He learned that escape could be organized, that liberation could be coordinated, that network existed not just to save individuals, but to dismantle systems piece by piece. He learned that return, unthinkable as it sounded, was sometimes part of the strategy. Freedom, in this context, was not just escape. It was intervention. The decision to return did not come quickly. It was shaped by memory and obligation. Safety tugged against responsibility. The distance from the plantation brought clarity, but also guilt. He could remain free, attempt to build a life in secrecy, and perhaps succeed. But doing so would leave behind those who could not follow without him. This realization marked the true transformation. The second escape was not an endpoint, it was a turning point. It revealed that freedom taken alone would always feel incomplete. His family remained within the system's reach, subject to the same violence and surveillance that had shaped him. Leaving them behind would mean accepting a freedom defined by abandonment. The risk of return was enormous. Recapture would almost certainly mean death. Those who crossed the boundary and came back voluntarily were viewed as irredeemable threats. The system had no tolerance for that kind of defiance. Still, the decision solidified. He would go back, not as a fugitive, but as a strategist. This choice reframes the second escape entirely. It was not about running away, it was about learning enough to come back prepared. The journey outward gathered knowledge, connections, and perspective. The journey back would apply them. What makes this keynote essential is its challenge to conventional narratives of freedom. We are taught to see escape as the final act, the moment of resolution. Here, escape becomes education. It teaches what must be done next. The system believed that once someone escaped successfully, they would disappear. It did not account for return motivated by love and responsibility. That blind spot would prove costly. When he turned back toward Alabama, he did so with eyes open. He understood the risks. He understood the cruelty he would re-enter. But he also understood something the system did not: that knowledge moves more freely than bodies. He carried with him methods, contacts, and the certainty that the world beyond the plantation was not empty. The second escape succeeded not because it ended in freedom, but because it expanded possibility. It transformed escape from a solitary act into a collective strategy. It set the stage for the most dangerous choice of all: to walk willingly back into bondage in order to dismantle it from within. This keynote stands at the threshold between survival and sacrifice. Everything that follows depends on the clarity gained here. Without it, the story would end with a single man's freedom. With it, the story moves towards something far more radical: collective liberation. Returning was not a moment of weakness, it was the most dangerous strength he ever summoned. After tasting freedom the second time, after breathing air not regulated by another man's permission, the idea of stepping back into slavery felt almost impossible to carry. Freedom alters the body and the mind. Once a person has experienced choice, even in limited form, surrendering it again feels like tearing something vital away. Yet he turned back, not because he doubted freedom, but because freedom that abandoned his family felt hollow, unfinished, and morally unbearable. The journey back was heavier than the escape itself. When he had fled, every step forward had carried the promise of relief. Now, every step carried the certainty of danger. He was moving toward a place designed to destroy people like him, toward overseers who would recognize him, toward punishments refined precisely to break those who dared to resist twice. He knew that if discovered, mercy would not be considered. The system does not forgive repetition. It eliminates it. What sustained him was not bravery in the traditional sense. It was obligation. His family's faces were never absent from his thoughts. He remembered their routines, their vulnerabilities, the ways the system used them as leverage. He understood that his absence might temporarily spare him, but it did nothing to change their fate. Worse, it could make them targets. A missing man invites suspicion. Suspicion invites punishment. Returning meant re-entering a world where he would have to perform submission convincingly enough to survive. He could not return as someone changed, even though he was. Every gesture would be scrutinized, every word weighed. He would have to become smaller on the outside while carrying something immense within, the knowledge that escape was possible, repeatable, and expandable. Crossing back into Alabama felt like crossing into a different version of time. The air itself seemed heavier, the land remembered him. Familiar paths now felt hostile, charged with memory. Yet familiarity also offered camouflage. He knew where to walk, when to pause, how to blend back into routine without drawing attention. The reunion with his family was quiet, controlled, and devastating. There could be no open expression of joy or relief. Emotion itself was dangerous. Everything had to look unchanged. But beneath the surface, something irreversible had happened. He had returned not as a dependent, but as a protector. Not as someone waiting for rescue, but as someone preparing it. This choice redefined heroism entirely. Stories often celebrate escape as the ultimate victory, but rarely linger on what it means to go back. Returning meant accepting renewed surveillance, renewed risk, renewed vulnerability. It meant choosing collective safety or individual survival. That choice carries a cost few are willing to pay. The plantation did not immediately suspect his full story. Absence could be explained. People vanished and reappeared under slavery, often enough that not every return triggered alarm. But the system watched more closely than before. He was marked. Any mistake could unravel everything. Living again under bondage, after freedom required an extraordinary discipline of mind. He had to suppress reactions that freedom had awakened. He had to obey orders that now felt absurd and illegitimate. He had to endure humiliation knowing it was no longer absolute. This was perhaps the hardest part, submitting not because he believed in the system, but because submission was now tactical. Inside, a quiet plan began to take shape. It was not fully formed, not yet actionable, but it had direction. Every observation mattered. Every routine became data. He studied movement patterns not just for himself, but for others. He learned who might be trusted, who might panic, who might endure silence. Organizing escape required more than courage. It required coordination among people trained by the system to distrust one another. The emotional toll of this choice cannot be overstated. Returning meant living with constant awareness of what could be lost. Every day carried the possibility of exposure. Every night carried the tie-in of whether this sacrifice would ultimately succeed or simply multiply suffering. Doubt was a constant companion. The difference now was that doubt no longer paralyzed him. It was absorbed into decision-making. The system underestimated the power of someone who had left and returned voluntarily. It understood fear, hunger, punishment. It did not understand commitment rooted in love. Love does not operate on the same logic as control. It does not seek efficiency. It accepts risk without expectation of reward. This keynote exposes the moral center of the story. Without this choice, everything that follows becomes accidental. With it, every later success becomes intentional. He was no longer reacting to the system, he was engaging it strategically. Returning also revealed the limits of the plantation's authority. They could control bodies but not meaning. His return was meant to signify defeat. Instead, it marked escalation. He had learned too much to be fully contained again. Knowledge, once acquired, does not vanish when circumstances change. The danger of this choice lay not only in recapture, but in emotional fracture. Carrying freedom silently, while pretending submission demands a resilience few can sustain. It requires separating inner truth from outward performance day after day. That separation can destroy people. It did not destroy him because it was anchored in purpose beyond himself. His family became both motivation and vulnerability. Protecting them required secrecy. Secrecy required emotional restraint. He could not explain everything to them immediately. Trust had to be built gradually, carefully. One wrong word spoken to the wrong person could doom them all. This return was not an ending. It was the most fragile beginning imaginable. Everything depended on patience, timing, and trust under conditions designed to erase all three. History often labels such choices as reckless or irrational. From the outside, returning to slavery appears unthinkable. But from within this story, it was the only choice that made sense. Freedom that costs everyone else is not freedom, it is escape without justice. By stepping back into bondage, he inverted the logic of the system. Slavery depended on the belief that once freedom was tasted, no one would return. His return shattered that assumption. It demonstrated that the desire to free others can outweigh the instinct to preserve oneself. This keynote is the pivot on which the entire narrative turns. It transforms a story of survival into a story of liberation. It explains why what follows is not chance, but consequence, and it forces us to confront a difficult truth. The most powerful acts of resistance often look from the outside like submission. In choosing to return, he accepted the possibility of death so that others might live differently. That choice cannot be measured by success alone. It stands on its own, heavy with risk, grounded in love, and carried forward into everything forward. What followed his return was not immediate action, but a long, deliberate stillness. Planning freedom in a place designed to extinguish planning required patience that bordered on self-erasure. He understood now that movement without coordination was reckless, and coordination without trust was impossible. The system relied on isolation to maintain control, and so resistance had to begin by quietly rebuilding connection. Every day became an exercise in observation and restraint. He learned how to listen without appearing attentive, how to speak in fragments that carried meaning only to those meant to hear it. Words were dangerous, tone and timing mattered more. Messages were folded into routine conversations, hidden inside complaints about work or weather, passed through expressions that would seem meaningless to anyone not already alert to them. Trust could not be assumed. Years of enslavement had trained people to protect themselves first, often at the expense of others. Informants existed not because of loyalty to masters, but because survival sometimes demanded it. He moved carefully, testing trust through small disclosures, never revealing the full shape of the plan to any single person. Knowledge was distributed, compartmentalized so that exposure would not destroy everything at once. He began with his family, not because they were safest, but because they were essential. Their cooperation would be required, their discipline tested. He prepared them ally, not with promises but with possibilities. Hope introduced too quickly can be dangerous. It invites carelessness. He framed freedom not as escape, but as responsibility. Each person would have a role, a moment where silence mattered more than courage. The planning unfolded in plain sight. This was its greatest protection. No secret meetings, no sudden changes in behavior, no visible preparation. Everything remained ordinary. Ordinary was invisible. The system watched for disruption, not consistency. By maintaining routine, he exploited its assumptions. He mapped not just routes, but people, who could walk long distances without complaint, who panicked under pressure, who could remain silent when frightened. Children required different strategies than adults. The elderly required protection, not speed. Planning freedom for an entire family meant accounting for weakness as carefully as for strength. Time became the most valuable resource. He waited for seasons that favored movement, for nights that masked sound, for conditions that reduced suspicion. Waiting was not passive. It was active calculation. Every delay refined the plan. Every interruption revealed vulnerabilities that could be addressed. Risk was constant. Any unusual behavior could trigger scrutiny. He learned to absorb stress without releasing it. Fear could not show. Determination could not show. The performance of submission had to remain flawless. What sustained him was not certainty of success, but clarity of purpose. Even if the plan failed, the attempt itself would disrupt the system's sense of inevitability. But he did not plan for failure. He planned for survival beyond the attempt. He also learned to accept help without depending on it. External assistance could vanish suddenly. Weather could change. People could be reassigned or sold. The plan had to adapt constantly, like a living thing. Flexibility was built into every step. Emotionally, this period was exhausting. Holding so much unspoken intention created isolation even among those he loved. He carried the burden of decision alone, knowing that a mistake would not cost him only his life, but theirs. Leadership under bondage was not empowering, it was crushing. Yet he carried it because no one else could. The system believed it had reduced him to predictability. In truth, predictability had become his weapon. He was always where expected, doing what was expected, saying what was expected. Inside that predictability, preparation grew unnoticed. This keynote reveals resistance as something slow and methodical, not dramatic. Freedom was not seized in a single act, but assembled piece by piece through patience, trust, and discipline. By the time the plan was ready, it had been tested mentally thousands of times. Every possible failure had been imagined. Every response rehearsed silently. Nothing could be guaranteed, but nothing was left unconsidered. This was freedom built in the open, hidden by its ordinary. And when the moment finally arrived, it would appear sudden only to those who had never been paying attention. The night the family disappeared did not announce itself with drama or noise. It arrived like any other, wrapped in familiarity, relying on the plantation's confidence that nothing ever truly changed. This confidence was the final weakness. The system believed it understood the people it controlled so completely that it stopped imagining surprise. That belief made the night possible. There was no single moment when freedom began. It unfolded in fragments. A glance held a second longer than usual. A tool left where it did not belong. A child instructed earlier than necessary to stay close. Each movement meant nothing on its own. Together, they formed a quiet unraveling. Fear was everywhere, but it was disciplined fear. Panic would have ended everything. Each person carried their terror inward, understanding that silence was not merely obedience tonight, it was survival. No one spoke more than necessary. No one asked questions. The plan had already been accepted. Doubt now had no function. The first steps were the hardest. Leaving behind the known, even when the known is brutal, creates a strange pull. Habit is powerful. The body resists change even when the mind demands it. They moved slowly at first, not to delay, but to avoid drawing attention. Speed would come later, when distance made noise less dangerous. Children were guided by hands rather than words. Elderly leaned into support without complaint. Everyone understood that the weakest among them set the pace. Freedom was not a race. It was a collective movement bound by the limit of its most vulnerable members. The land tested them immediately. Darkness distorted distance. Sounds carried unpredictably. Every rustle felt amplified. The night offered cover but demanded caution. Paths memorized in daylight felt unfamiliar in shadow. Still, familiarity mattered. He had chosen routes, not because they were fast, but because they were known. At every pause, The weight of consequence pressed down. If discovered now, there would be no explanations, no second chances. The system would respond not with correction, but with eradication. That knowledge sharpened focus. Distraction was impossible. Each step required presence. Time stretched. Minutes felt like hours. The mind fought to remain anchored in the present, rather than racing ahead to imagined outcomes. Freedom existed only in the next step, not in what might follow. Thinking too far ahead risked mistakes. They crossed invisible thresholds without knowing it lying, beyond which the plantation's immediate reach weakened, even if its influence did not vanish entirely. Each threshold shifted the balance slightly, making pursuit more difficult, making hope more dangerous. Hope can undo discipline if allowed to bloom too early. At one point, sound broke the night in a way that froze them all. A distant call. A movement they could not identify. The instinct to scatter had to be suppressed instantly. Scattering would have meant separation, and separation would have meant capture. They waited, breath held, bodies still, trusting the play even when fear demanded action. When the sound passed without consequence, they moved again, slower now, recalibrated. Every close call reminded them how fragile the moment was. Freedom was not something to be claimed. It was something to be protected minute by minute. The children struggled silently. Confusion flickered across their faces, restrained by the seriousness in the adults around them. They did not fully understand where they were going. Only that stopping was not an option. Innocence was both a vulnerability and a source of strength. It demanded protection and inspired endurance. As distance grew, something subtle changed. The air felt different, not safer, but less controlled. The plantation's rhythms no longer governed their movement. No bell marked time. No overseer dictated pace. This absence of command was disorienting. Freedom, at first, does not feel like triumph. It feels like uncertainty. Dawn threatened exposure. Night had been an ally, but it could not last forever. Timing mattered now more than ever. They needed to reach a point where daylight would not betray them completely. This pressure demanded faster movement without sacrificing caution. It was a delicate balance. Fatigue crept in relentlessly. Bodies unused to sustained travel protested. Blisters formed, muscles cramped. Pain had to be managed without sound. Complaints were swallowed. Everyone understood that stopping too long risked everything. Trust became absolute. There was no room for second-guessing leadership now. Decisions had to be followed instantly, without debate. This trust had been built over months of preparation, of quiet reassurance and shared resolve. Now it proved its worth. The moment they realized pursuit had not begun was not celebratory. It was suspicious. Systems rarely fail silently, but sometimes complacency delays response. Sometimes disappearance takes time to register. They used that time without sentimentality. When they finally reached a place where movement could pause, where hiding could become resting, the release was partial and restrained. Relief was dangerous. They did not yet belong to freedom. They were merely beyond immediate capture. The night the family disappeared did not end slavery for them. It ended something equally powerful, inevitability. From that night forward, their lives would be uncertain, precarious, and threatened, but no longer predetermined. This keynote is not about victory. It is about execution under impossible conditions. It is about what it takes to move not one body, but many through a world designed to trap them. It is about discipline, trust, and the quiet courage of people who know that hesitation is more dangerous than fear. History often condenses such nights into a single sentence: they escaped. That sentence erases everything that mattered: the terror, the coordination, the restraint, the constant negotiation between speed and silence. It hides the truth that freedom is not seized in a moment, but carried step by careful step through darkness. By morning, the plantation would notice absence. By then, the shape of pursuit would already be outdated. What they chased would no longer exist in the form they expected. A family had moved together intact, guided by someone who understood that freedom is not an individual achievement. The night they disappeared did not close the story. It opened it. What followed the disappearance was not immediate freedom, but a long season of uncertainty that tested every belief they had carried with them into the night. Escape did not dissolve danger. It transformed it. The threat was no longer fixed to a single place, but spread across every road, every unfamiliar face, every sound that lingered a moment too long. Survival now depended on reading the world quickly and correctly, on understanding which spaces offered shelter and which concealed traps. They learned that movement itself could be suspicious. Traveling too fast drew attention, but lingering invited question. Each decision became a calculation shaped by instinct, experience, and a growing awareness of how the world treated people who did not belong. Freedom demanded intelligence as much as courage. It required knowing when to blend in and when to vanish entirely. Food became a constant concern. Hunger sharpened tempers and weakened bodies. Yet desperation could not be allowed to dictate choices. Stealing risked exposure. Accepting help risked betrayal. They learned to stretch what little they had, to ration not only food but energy, hope, and conversation. Silence remained a form of protection. Trust outside their group was the most dangerous gamble. Some faces offered kindness without question. Others concealed hostility behind politeness. They learned to observe before engaging, to listen more than speak. The language of safety was subtle tone, posture, timing. A wrong word could undo weeks of careful movement. The children adapted in ways that unsettled the adults. They learned to be still, to hide emotion, to recognize when curiosity was dangerous. Childhood shortened, replaced by awareness. This loss carried its own grief, but there was no space to mourn it. Survival demanded adaptation, not reflection. Night travel continued, but it changed. Darkness was no longer just cover, it became a rhythm. Days were for concealment, nights for progress. Sleep came in fragments, shallow and alert. Dreams blurred with memory, haunted by footsteps and shouts that no longer existed but still felt possible. At times, doubt surfaced quietly. Had they chosen the right path? Had escape merely exchanged one form of suffering for another? These thoughts were never spoken aloud. Piquing them risked weakening resolve, and resolve was the most valuable resource they possessed. Faith in the decision had to be maintained, even when evidence felt thin. The world beyond the plantation revealed its own hierarchies and cruelties. Freedom did not mean equality. It meant navigating a landscape filled with laws, customs, and unspoken rules designed to limit movement and opportunity. They learned quickly that being free and being safe were not the same thing. Moments of kindness carried disproportionate weight. A shared meal. Directions given without suspicion. A door left unlocked at the right time. These moments did not erase danger, but they reminded the group that humanity existed beyond control and ownership. Gratitude became another emotion they learned to hold quietly. Leadership shifted subtly. The one who guided escape did not command obedience through force, but earned it through consistency. Decisions were made with consideration, explained when possible, enforced when necessary. Authority rooted in care proved stronger than authority rooted in fear. The constant tension reshaped relationships. Small conflicts flared and extinguished quickly, smothered by the knowledge that division could be fatal. Forgiveness became practical rather than emotional. There was no room for pride. Cooperation was survival. As days blurred into weeks, something unexpected emerged. Identity. Away from imposed roles, each person began to rediscover themselves. Skills on, say hidden, became valuable. Stories once suppressed found quiet listeners. Names carried new weight when spoken without ownership attached to them. Yet the past never fully released its grip. Memories surfaced uninvited, triggered by smells, sounds, or simple routines. Trauma did not disappear with distance. It traveled alongside them, shaping reactions and fears. Healing, if it was possible, would take longer than escape. The fear of capture never vanished completely. Even when signs of pursuit faded, vigilance remained. Freedom was fragile, and the consequences of losing it were well understood. This awareness sharpened perception, but also exhausted the spirit. Constant alertness demanded a price. Eventually, the idea of a future began to take shape, not clearly, not confidently, but enough to matter. Education, work, land, community, the concepts felt both distant and dangerously hopeful. Hope, once forbidden, now had to be managed carefully. Too much could distract. Too little could break resolve. The journey taught them that freedom was not a destination but a practice. It required daily choices, constant adjustment, and an acceptance that safety might never be absolute. Yet even this imperfect freedom offered something the plantation never could: agency. The ability to decide, even under constraint, carried its own power. This keynote is about endurance after escape, about the reality that follows the dramatic moment history prefers to remember. It is about the long, unrecorded struggle to remain free in a world structured to deny that possibility. It honors not just the act of fleeing, but the discipline required to keep moving forward when celebration is impossible. By the time they reached a place where sting became conceivable, they were no longer the same people who had left. Hardship had reshaped them, not into symbols, but into survivors with layered identities and hard-earned wisdom. Freedom had not softened them, it had clarified them. Their story does not end with arrival or safety. It continues in every choice made afterward, in every risk weighed against necessity, in every moment they refused to surrender the autonomy they had claimed. This is the truth history often overlooks. Escape is only the beginning, and remaining free is the greater, quieter victory.